Hello, America and the world. This is Radio Free Market, and I am your host, Michael McKay. We are behind the lines of socialism, my friends, and Radio Free Market is the voice of free people and free markets. Our topic today is They're Not Immigrants, They're Refugees, a critical look at migration, immigration, jobs, national security, and the welfare state. We are very honored to have with us today Professor Don Boudreaux. Welcome, Don.
Good to be here.
Good. Folks, Don is a professor of economics at George Mason University, a former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and the author of the excellent book, Globalization, and one of the foremost scholars in the world today on the philosophy of freedom and liberty. Don, before we talk about immigration, let's talk about migration and travel for a minute. For most of history, most people traveled without the approval of the state, without a passport. The risk of travel was on the traveler and not the state. When did that start to change?
My understanding is that it changed about 100 years ago, right around the World War I era. I'm not exactly sure, but I know that Russia and Turkey were two of the first countries to actually demand passports of people entering their societies, their countries. And, you know, those two countries back then were not exactly the freest on earth. Free countries in Western Europe, North America, even South America didn't have any such restrictions as we have today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it started about 100 years ago, and prior to that time, people just went where they wanted to go. And were they basically harassed by local authorities if they were foreigners?
No. Not, well, I'm speaking mostly of America, not that I'm aware of. You know, every society has a certain fear of foreigners, and that's why you had places like Chinatown and my hometown in New Orleans, the Irish Channel. You had these enclaves of immigrants, and so people wanted to, you know, sort of stay to themselves. But after the first generation or two, they merged into the larger culture, which is why we have this wonderful, vibrant, diverse culture in America today.
So prior to the whole passport, visa kind of transformation in world travel, how did they keep out troublemakers? Or did they?
Well, in the United States, you know, the system that we had basically until 1924, the mid-1920s, was we had checkpoints, Ellis Island being the most important one, most famous one, and people would come through. There were no numerical limits on the number of people who could come. There were no racial or ethnic or religious or country origin restrictions. People came. The authorities at these checkpoints checked to make sure these people didn't have any serious communicable diseases, and to make sure that they weren't known violent criminals. If people weren't these two, if they didn't have those two things against them, they were allowed in. End of story.
So, of course, you know, there have always been those that wanted to pull up the ladder of opportunity to prevent others from getting aboard. Some of the early founders of America wanted more open immigration, others wanted less. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, you know, immigration is mentioned explicitly in the Declaration of Independence. One of the complaints, explicit complaints, lodged by Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues in 1776 against King George III was that King George put too many restrictions on the number of people allowed to immigrate into, then British North America. And the founders of our country saw that restriction rightly as indeed not only restricting the freedoms of the people who wanted to immigrate into America, but restricting the economic opportunities of Americans themselves, because the fewer workers you have here, the less opportunity there is here to prosper and thrive.
We're going to, when we come back from our break, expand on this concept of migration, because we Americans are pretty used to the idea of going wherever we want to go. But we're going to take a brief break, folks, so please stay with us. This is Michael McKay in Radio Free Market. I'm talking with Professor Don Boudreaux. We'll be back in just a minute, so please stay with us. Talk to you soon.